The champagne flute slipped from my mother's manicured fingers, shattering against the marble floor of our family estate. She stood frozen, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the shock spreading across her face as the President of the United States looked directly at me and declared, "Dr. Emma Rodriguez has single-handedly saved more lives than anyone in this room." What my mother didn't know was that while she'd spent years calling me a failure, I'd been quietly working 18-hour days in government labs, developing the breakthrough treatments that had just prevented a global catastrophe. The woman who told me I'd never amount to anything was about to watch me receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the circular driveway of our family's Mediterranean villa in Riverside, California, as I pulled my modest Honda Civic between a row of gleaming luxury vehicles. Mercedes, BMWs, and Teslas lined the pristine pathway like expensive jewelry displayed in a showroom window. My car looked painfully out of place among the automotive aristocracy, much like I always felt among my own family. I sat for a moment in the driver's seat, watching through the windshield as valets in crisp white uniforms efficiently directed traffic around the fountain centerpiece. The estate sprawled before me like something from a magazine cover, all terracotta roofs and perfectly manicured gardens. This wasn't just my childhood home. It was Victoria Rodriguez's monument to success, a testament to the real estate empire she'd built from nothing after my father's death. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, elegant script on ivory cardstock announcing Marcus and Rachel's engagement party. My younger brother had always been the golden child, the one who followed mother into the family business, the one whose achievements were celebrated with champagne toasts and newspaper announcements. I'd almost declined, but something about the formal tone of the invitation made me reconsider. Perhaps it was time to try again. The heavy oak front door opened before I could knock, revealing our longtime housekeeper Maria, whose warm smile provided the first genuine welcome I'd received. She embraced me briefly, whispering in Spanish that I looked too thin, that I needed to eat more. Her maternal concern was a stark contrast to what awaited me inside. The grand foyer buzzed with conversation and laughter, the sound of 50 successful people discussing their latest acquisitions and accomplishments. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the gathering, casting prismatic light across faces I recognized from society pages and business journals. These were Riverside's elite, the power brokers and influence peddlers who shaped Southern California's economic landscape. I spotted Victoria immediately, resplendent in a silk designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She was holding court near the curved marble staircase, gesturing expressively as she recounted some story to a captivated audience. Her auburn hair was styled in perfect waves, and her jewelry caught the light with every movement. At 58, she remained striking, her presence commanding attention from everyone in the room. Marcus stood beside her, tall and confident in his tailored navy suit. At 32, he possessed the easy charm that had always made everything seem effortless for him. His success in investment banking had been meteoric, each promotion celebrated with family dinners and proud announcements. He was everything Victoria had hoped for in a child, everything I had apparently failed to become. When Victoria's eyes found mine across the crowded room, her animated expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The warm smile she'd been sharing with her guests became more measured, more polite. She excused herself from her conversation and approached me with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to managing social situations. "Emma, darling," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume for nearby guests to hear. "I wasn't sure you'd make it. I know how busy you must be with your little research projects." The words were delivered with a smile, but the dismissal was unmistakable. My 15 years of medical research, my doctorate in epidemiology, my work with the Centers for Disease Control, all reduced to little research projects in a single breath. She guided me toward a corner of the room, away from the main gathering, her hand light but firm on my elbow. "I've seated you at table 12, she continued, in a lower voice. "It's mostly colleagues from Marcus's firm and some family friends. I thought you'd be more comfortable there than with the medical professionals at the other tables." The implication was clear. I didn't belong with the real doctors, the successful ones who ran private practices and medical centers. The sting of her words was familiar, a pattern that had defined our relationship since my father's death 12 years ago. Dr. James Thompson had been a brilliant CDC researcher, a man who understood the importance of public health and scientific discovery. He would have been proud of the path I'd chosen, proud of the work I'd dedicated my life to pursuing. But his voice had been silenced by the same pandemic that had eventually shaped my career. Victoria had never understood his passion for research, had never grasped why he chose government service over private practice wealth. After his death, she'd thrown herself into building her real estate empire, perhaps trying to prove that financial success was the only metric that mattered. In her world, worth was measured in profit margins and property values, not in lives saved or diseases prevented. As the evening progressed, I found myself relegated to the edges of conversations, introduced as Emma, my other child, or the one who works for the government. Each introduction felt like a subtle erasure of my accomplishments, a reduction of my identity to something small and unremarkable. When asked about my work, I learned to give simple answers that wouldn't bore the audience or challenge their preconceptions about what constituted meaningful success. The engagement toasts began after dinner, a series of speeches celebrating Marcus and Rachel's future together. Victoria spoke eloquently about her son's achievements, his Harvard MBA, his rapid rise in the financial world, his promise as a future leader in their family business. The applause was thunderous, the pride in her voice unmistakable. When she finished, Marcus took the microphone, his confidence evident as he thanked everyone for their support. He spoke about building on the family legacy, about expanding their business empire, about making his parents proud. He never mentioned our father, never acknowledged the other kind of legacy that had shaped our family's history. Standing in that opulent room, surrounded by wealth and celebration, I felt the familiar weight of invisibility settling over my shoulders like a heavy coat. These people saw only what Victoria wanted them to see, a successful family led by a powerful matriarch and her accomplished son. The daughter who had spent her career fighting pandemics and developing life-saving treatments remained hidden in plain sight, a footnote in their carefully crafted narrative of success. The next morning, I found myself driving through the quiet streets of Riverside as dawn painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Sleep had eluded me after the engagement party, my mind replaying the evening's subtle humiliations and calculated dismissals. The weight of being a stranger in my own family's story had settled deep in my chest, creating an ache that no amount of professional success seemed capable of healing. My destination was Riverside National Cemetery, a sprawling expanse of white headstones that stretched across rolling hills like an endless field of remembrance. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of eucalyptus trees and dampened grass. This sacred ground held thousands of stories, thousands of lives dedicated to something greater than personal gain. Among them lay my father, Dr. James Thompson, the man whose legacy had shaped everything I'd become. I found his grave easily, having made this pilgrimage countless times over the past 12 years. The headstone was simple, elegant in its restraint. Dr. James Michael Thompson, beloved father and healer, 1968 to 2012. Fresh flowers adorned the base, white roses that Maria must have placed there during her weekly visits. She understood the importance of honoring his memory, even when his own family seemed to have forgotten. Kneeling beside the cold marble, I traced his name with my fingertip, feeling the carved letters that spelled out a life of service and sacrifice. My father had been a quiet giant in the field of epidemiology, a researcher whose work on emerging infectious diseases had laid the groundwork for modern pandemic response protocols. His papers were still cited in medical journals, his methodologies still taught in graduate programs around the world. Yet Victoria had always viewed his government salary as evidence of limited ambition, his dedication to public health as a failure to maximize his earning potential. The memories flooded back with crystalline clarity, each one a treasured artifact from a childhood shaped by two very different philosophies about what constituted a meaningful life. I remembered summer evenings in his home laboratory, a converted garage filled with microscopes and research equipment, where he would patiently explain the intricate world of viruses and bacteria. His eyes would light up as he described how tiny organisms could change the course of human history, how understanding their behavior could save millions of lives. Science isn't about being the smartest person in the room, Emma, he had told me during one of those sessions, his voice gentle but firm. It's about being curious enough to ask the right questions and persistent enough to find the answers, even when everyone else has given up. He would show me slides of different pathogens, explaining their structures and behaviors with the enthusiasm of a child sharing his favorite toys. To him, every virus was a puzzle to be solved, every outbreak a challenge to be overcome. Those lessons had taken root deep in my soul, growing into a passion that would define my entire career. While other children dreamed of becoming movie stars or professional athletes, I fantasized about working in government labs, developing vaccines, and preventing the next great pandemic. My father nurtured this dream, encouraging my interest in biology and chemistry, helping me design science fair projects that explored infectious disease transmission and prevention methods. Victoria had tolerated these interests during my childhood, dismissing them as a phase one would eventually outgrow. She assumed that once I reached high school, I would naturally gravitate toward more practical pursuits, perhaps business or law, fields that offered clear paths to financial success and social status. When I announced my intention to pursue a pre-med track at UC Davis, focusing on infectious disease research, her disappointment was palpable. The conversation had taken place in our formal dining room, the same room where last night's engagement party guests had enjoyed their elaborate dinner. Victoria had set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision, her expression carefully controlled as she processed my announcement. "Emma, darling," she had said, her voice carrying the patient tone one might use with a confused child. "Medical research is a noble hobby, but it's not a practical career. You'll spend your entire life working in windowless laboratories for government wages, while your classmates build real wealth in private practice." My father had been present for that conversation, his support evident in the encouraging nod he gave me when Victoria wasn't looking. He understood that my calling wasn't about money or prestige, it was about service, about using my talents to protect people who would never know my. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Name. That understanding had sustained me through years of family disapproval and social isolation, knowing that at least one person comprehended the value of my chosen path. The irony wasn't lost on me that Victoria's criticism of government wages came from a woman who had built her fortune through connections made possible by my father's respected position in federal health agencies. His reputation had opened doors, his colleagues had become some of her first major clients, and his dedication to public service had provided the family with credibility and social standing. Yet she had somehow convinced herself that her success was entirely self-made, that his contributions were minimal and unimportant. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck in early 2020, my father had been among the first researchers called to study the novel coronavirus. At 64, he could have chosen to work remotely, to minimize his exposure while contributing to the research effort from a safe distance. Instead, he had insisted on working directly with active samples, believing that hands-on research was essential for understanding the virus's behavior and developing effective countermeasures. The call had come on a Tuesday morning in March 2012, just as the world was beginning to understand the true scope of the crisis. My father had collapsed in his laboratory at the CDC's Atlanta facility, overcome by the very virus he had been working to defeat. The official cause of death was complications from COVID-19, but I knew the deeper truth. He had died doing exactly what he believed in, sacrificing his own safety in pursuit of knowledge that might save others. Victoria's reaction to his death had been complex and painful to witness. She grieved genuinely for the man she had loved, despite their philosophical differences about success and purpose. Yet even in her mourning, she couldn't resist reframing his death as a cautionary tale about the dangers of choosing service over security. If only he had gone into private practice, she would say to friends and family members, he would still be alive today. Government work is just too dangerous, too unpredictable. This narrative had become her explanation for everything that followed. Her determination to build a business empire, her insistence that Marcus join the family real estate company, her disappointment in my decision to follow my father's path into medical research. In her mind, his death had proven that dedication to public service was not just financially unrewarding but potentially fatal. She was determined that her children would choose differently, that we would prioritize safety and wealth over the dangerous nobility of serving others. But as I knelt beside his grave that morning, feeling the weight of his absence and the power of his example, I knew that his death hadn't diminished the importance of his work. If anything, it had proven how desperately the world needed people willing to take risks for the greater good. The vaccines that had eventually controlled the pandemic were built on a research foundation he had helped establish. The treatment protocols that had saved millions of lives incorporated methodologies he had developed. His sacrifice had meaning, even if Victoria couldn't see it. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air and illuminating the endless rows of headstones that surrounded us. Each marker represented someone who had chosen service over safety, duty over personal gain. My father belonged among these heroes, and I was proud to be his daughter, proud to carry forward his legacy of quiet dedication and scientific integrity. Standing slowly, I placed my hand on his headstone one final time, feeling a familiar resolve crystallizing in my chest. The engagement party had reminded me of how small Victoria wanted me to feel, how invisible she needed me to remain in order to preserve her carefully constructed narrative about success and failure. But this place, this sacred ground where heroes rested, reminded me of who I really was and what I had accomplished in the 12 years since his death. I wasn't the failed daughter Victoria described to her friends. I was Dr. Emma Rodriguez, senior researcher at the CDC, holder of 3 patents for infectious disease treatments, and the woman who had spent the last decade quietly saving lives while my family counted their profits. The world might not know my name yet, but that was about to change in ways that would shock everyone who had ever dismissed my work as unimportant. Walking back toward my car, I felt my father's presence with me, his voice echoing in my memory with the words that had guided my entire career. The most important work is often the most invisible work, Emma. But invisible doesn't mean insignificant. The people you save will never know your name, but they will live because of your dedication. That's a legacy worth building. The fluorescent lights of the CDC laboratory hummed overhead as I adjusted the microscope focus, bringing the viral sample into sharp clarity. It was 3 in the morning, and the building was nearly empty except for the security guards and a handful of researchers like myself who had made these sterile corridors our second home. The sample before me represented 18 months of intensive research, countless failed experiments, and breakthrough moments that had kept me awake for days at a time. What the scientific community didn't yet know was that we were sitting on the edge of a potential catastrophe. The virus I was studying, designated H7N9 Delta in our internal reports, had emerged from a remote region of Southeast Asia 6 months earlier. Initial cases had been contained, but our modeling suggested that without intervention, this pathogen could spread globally within weeks, with a mortality rate that made COVID-19 look manageable by comparison. My team had been working in complete secrecy, operating under the highest levels of government classification. The public couldn't know how close we were to another pandemic, couldn't understand that the normal rhythm of their daily lives hung in the balance, while researchers like me raced against time in underground laboratories. The weight of that responsibility was something I carried alone, unable to share the burden even with those closest to me. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Victoria had spent the engagement party describing my work as insignificant government bureaucracy, I had been leading the most critical public health initiative in a generation. My official title, Senior Research Scientist, barely hinted at the scope of my responsibilities. In reality, I was heading a multinational task force that included researchers from the World Health Organization, the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, and laboratories across 3 continents. The breakthrough had come during a marathon session 2 weeks earlier, when my colleague Dr. Sarah Kim noticed an unusual protein structure that seemed to be the key to the virus's rapid transmission. Building on research methodologies my father had developed years earlier, we had identified a potential weak point in the pathogen's defense mechanisms. The solution wasn't a traditional vaccine, which would take years to develop and distribute, but rather a targeted antiviral treatment that could be manufactured quickly and deployed globally. My phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Dr. Michael Park, the CDC's Director of Emergency Response. The text was brief but loaded with significance. Congressional briefing tomorrow at 0800. Your presentation could change everything. The president wants to meet with you personally afterward." My hands trembled slightly as I read the words. After years of working in the shadows, my research was about to reach the highest levels of government. The Congressional Briefing Room was a windowless chamber deep within the Capitol building, its walls lined with monitors displaying classified intelligence feeds from around the world. 24 senators and representatives sat around a polished mahogany table, their faces grave as they absorbed the implications of what I was about to tell them. These were people accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of lives, yet the weight of this particular moment was evident in their silence. I stood at the head of the table, my laptop connected to the room's secure presentation system, feeling the collective attention of the most powerful legislative body in the world focused entirely on my words. The slides I had prepared contained 18 months of research distilled into clear, actionable intelligence that would determine how quickly the government could respond to an emerging threat. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "we have approximately 72 hours before this virus achieves community transmission in major population centers. Without immediate intervention, we are looking at a mortality rate of 12% across all age groups, with higher concentrations in urban areas." The numbers landed in the room like physical blows, each statistic representing thousands of potential casualties. Senator Williams from Texas leaned forward, her expression intense. "Dr. Rodriguez, what you're describing sounds like a worst-case scenario. How confident are you in these projections?" Her question carried the weight of someone who understood that political careers could be made or destroyed by responses to public health crises. I clicked to the next slide, revealing the mathematical models my team had developed. "Senator, these projections are based on transmission data from 17 similar outbreaks over the past decade. Our confidence level is 94%. More importantly, we have developed a treatment protocol that can reduce transmission by 87% if implemented within the next week." The room erupted in questions, lawmakers demanding details about manufacturing capabilities, distribution logistics, and international coordination requirements. For the next 3 hours, I fielded inquiries that would have stumped most medical professionals, drawing on knowledge accumulated through years of studying emerging infectious diseases. Every answer I provided was backed by peer-reviewed research, every recommendation supported by data that had been verified multiple times. Representative Chen from California asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Dr. Rodriguez, if we implement your recommendations immediately, how many lives are we talking about saving?" The room fell silent, everyone understanding that the answer would determine the scope and urgency of the government's response. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each lawmaker before responding. "Based on our most conservative estimates, immediate implementation of our treatment protocol will prevent approximately 2.3 million deaths in the United States alone. Global implementation could save upward of 40 million lives worldwide." The numbers hung in the air like a benediction, the mathematical proof of why my father had dedicated his life to this work. The meeting concluded with unanimous approval for emergency funding and immediate implementation of our treatment protocol. As the lawmakers filed out, discussing logistics and coordination strategies, I felt a profound sense of validation that had nothing to do with personal recognition. This was what my father had dreamed of: science serving humanity at the highest levels, research translated into action that would preserve countless lives. The president's office was smaller than I had expected, its famous oval shape somehow more intimate in person than in the countless photographs and television broadcasts I had seen over the years. President Harrison sat behind the historic Resolute desk, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened, looking like a man who had been working through complex problems for hours. The weight of his office was evident in the lines around his eyes, the careful way he chose his words. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said, standing to shake my hand, "I've been briefed on your work and I have to say, what you've accomplished is nothing short of extraordinary. Your research may have just prevented one of the worst pandemics in human history." His words carried the authority of the most powerful office in the world, yet his tone was personal, almost paternal. We sat in the comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace, The formal atmosphere softened by the president's genuine interest in understanding the scientific details of our breakthrough. For the next hour, he asked probing questions about the research process, the challenges we had overcome, and the international cooperation required to implement our solution globally. His intelligence and curiosity impressed me. This wasn't a politician going through the motions, but a leader genuinely committed to understanding the complexities of the crisis we had averted. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said as our meeting drew to a close, "I want you to know that your work represents the very best of American scientific excellence. You've demonstrated that government research, properly funded and supported, can literally save the world. I'm recommending you for the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and I want you to be our keynote speaker at the upcoming International Health Security Conference." The drive back to Riverside that evening felt surreal, the familiar landscape of Southern California highways taking on a dreamlike quality as I processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. My secure phone contained messages from colleagues around the world, congratulating me on the successful implementation of our treatment protocol. The global health community was buzzing with excitement about the breakthrough, though the general public remained unaware of how close they had come to catastrophe. I thought about Victoria and Marcus, probably discussing real estate deals and investment opportunities in their perfectly appointed offices, completely oblivious to the fact that their continued existence had been secured by the daughter and sister they considered a disappointment. The irony was almost laughable. While they measured success in profit margins and property values, I had just helped save millions of lives, including theirs. My phone rang as I pulled into my modest apartment complex, a stark contrast to the family estate where I had felt so out of place just days earlier. The caller ID showed Rachel Chen, Marcus's fiancée, a name I hadn't expected to see. We had barely spoken during the engagement party, and I couldn't imagine why she would be contacting me now. "Emma?" Her voice was hesitant, uncertain. "I hope I'm not calling too late. I was wondering if we could meet for coffee tomorrow. There's something important I need to discuss with you." The request was puzzling, but something in her tone suggested this wasn't a casual social invitation. The next morning found me sitting in a small cafe in downtown Riverside, watching Rachel approach through the window. She looked different outside the context of my family's social gatherings, more serious and less polished. When she sat down across from me, her expression was intense, almost conspiratorial. "Emma," she began without preamble, "I need you to know that I've been researching your work. What Marcus and your mother have been saying about your career doesn't match what I've been finding online." She pulled out her phone, showing me a series of academic papers and research citations. "You're not just some minor government employee. You're one of the leading researchers in your field." I studied her face, trying to understand her motivation for this investigation. Rachel worked in corporate finance, moving in the same circles as Marcus and Victoria, yet here she was questioning their narrative about my professional life. There was something almost defiant in her posture, as if she were taking a stand against the family she was about to join. "Rachel," I said carefully, "why does this matter to you? You're marrying into this family. My relationship with them shouldn't affect your future with Marcus." Even as I spoke the words, I was curious about her answer, intrigued by this unexpected interest in my work. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because I've watched how they treat you, Emma. I've seen the way your mother dismisses your achievements and how Marcus just goes along with it. But what I discovered about your research, about the lives you've saved, it's incredible. You deserve better than being treated like some kind of family embarrassment." Her words hit me with unexpected force, not because they revealed anything I didn't already know, but because they came from someone within my family's inner circle. For years, I had assumed that everyone in Victoria's world shared her values, that they all measured worth in the same superficial terms. The possibility that someone might see through the facade and recognize the value of my work was both surprising and deeply moving. "There's something else," Rachel continued, her expression growing more serious. "I think your mother is planning something for the wedding. She's been having private conversations with Marcus about your future, about how to handle what she calls the family's image problem. I don't know exactly what she's planning, but I wanted you to be prepared." The warning Rachel had given me echoed in my mind as I drove through the winding roads that led to Dr. Patricia Williams' consulting office in San Bernardino. The building was an unassuming two-story structure tucked between a medical supply company and a law firm, the kind of place that most people would pass without a second glance. But Patricia's reputation in the world of crisis management was legendary, built over 3 decades of helping high-profile clients navigate scandals, legal challenges, and public relations disasters. Patricia had been my father's colleague during his early years at the CDC, before she left government service to build her private consulting practice. When he spoke of her, it was always with deep respect for her analytical mind and her ability to see patterns that others missed. She understood the intersection of science, politics, and public perception in ways that made her invaluable to clients facing complex challenges. The receptionist led me through a series of hallways lined with framed photographs of Patricia with various political figures and business leaders. Her office occupied a corner of the building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the San Bernardino Mountains. The space felt more like a war room than a traditional office, with multiple computer monitors, whiteboards covered in strategic diagrams, and stacks of research reports organized with military precision. Patricia rose from behind her massive desk as I entered, her silver hair perfectly styled and her dark suit conveying authority and competence. At 62, she moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades solving problems that others considered impossible. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct and assessing. "Emma," she said, her voice warm but businesslike, "I was devastated to hear about your father's passing. James was one of the finest researchers I ever worked with, and I know he would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished." She gestured toward a comfortable seating area away from her desk, creating a more intimate setting for our conversation. "I've been following your career from a distance," she continued as we settled into the leather chairs. "Your work on emerging infectious diseases has been remarkable, though I suspect most people have no idea of the scope of your contributions. That's actually why I asked Rachel to arrange this meeting. I think you may need some professional guidance in the near future." I studied her face, trying to understand what she meant. Patricia had built her reputation on anticipating problems before they became crises, on identifying threats that her clients couldn't see coming. If she was concerned about my situation, it suggested that Rachel's warnings about Victoria's plans were more serious than I had realized. "Dr. Williams," I began, but she held up a hand to stop me. "Please, call me Patricia. We're not in a formal setting here." She reached for a thick folder from the side table next to her chair. "I've done some preliminary research on your family's business dealings and social connections. What I've found is interesting and potentially concerning from a strategic standpoint." She opened the folder, revealing a detailed analysis of Victoria's real estate empire, complete with financial records, business partnerships, and media coverage spanning the past 15 years. The thoroughness of the research was impressive, showing connections and patterns that I had never considered. Patricia had mapped out Victoria's entire sphere of influence, identifying key relationships and potential pressure points. "Your mother has built her success on carefully cultivating relationships with influential people," Patricia explained, pointing to a network diagram that resembled something from an intelligence briefing. "She's particularly skilled at controlling narratives, at presenting herself and her family in ways that serve her business interests. The problem is that your recent professional recognition threatens that carefully constructed image." I felt a chill run down my spine as I began to understand the implications of what she was saying. "You think she sees my success as a threat to her reputation?" Patricia nodded grimly. "Emma, your mother has spent years positioning herself as the family success story, the self-made woman who built an empire through her own determination and intelligence. Your father's government work was something she tolerated but never celebrated, and she's extended that attitude to your career. But now you're on the verge of receiving national recognition for work that could overshadow everything she's accomplished." She pulled out several newspaper clippings and online articles, showing me coverage of Victoria's business achievements over the years. In every story, she was portrayed as the driving force behind the family's success, with only passing mentions of my father's contributions or my own career. The pattern was clear. Victoria had carefully managed her public image to minimize any achievements that might compete with her own narrative. "The Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony is scheduled for next month," Patricia continued, And when that happens, you'll become the most prominent member of your family. Your mother won't be able to control that story or diminish its significance. For someone who has built her identity around being the family's primary achiever, that kind of shift in public perception could feel existential. I thought about the engagement party, about the way Victoria had dismissed my work as little research projects in front of her influential friends. What had seemed like casual belittlement now appeared more calculated, part of a broader strategy to manage how others perceived my place in the family hierarchy. "What do you think she's planning?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Patricia's expression grew more serious. "Based on the patterns I've observed and the intelligence Rachel has provided, I believe your mother is preparing to publicly discredit your achievements before the Medal of Freedom ceremony. She's likely planning to use the wedding as a platform to reshape the narrative around your career, to present herself as the family member who truly deserves recognition." She showed me a timeline she had constructed, marking key events and meetings in Victoria's schedule over the past month. The pattern was troubling: private dinners with influential contacts, meetings with public relations professionals, and conversations with journalists who covered local business and society news. It looked like the preparation for a coordinated campaign. "The wedding guest list includes several prominent figures from politics and media," Patricia continued. "If your mother wanted to disseminate a particular narrative about your work or your role in the family, this would be the perfect opportunity. She'd have a captive audience of influential people, all gathered to celebrate what appears to be a happy family occasion." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Victoria wasn't just planning to embarrass me at the wedding. She was preparing to systematically undermine my professional reputation before I could receive national recognition for my work. The timing wasn't coincidental. She needed to discredit me before the Medal of Freedom ceremony, before the public learned about my role in preventing a global pandemic. "Patricia," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "what would you recommend? How do I protect myself against something like this?" She smiled for the first time since our conversation began, and I caught a glimpse of the strategic mind that had made her legendary in crisis management circles. "Emma, your mother is planning to fight a public relations battle using outdated tactics. She's assuming that her social connections and media relationships will allow her to control the narrative. But she's forgotten something important. In the age of social media and instant information, truth has a way of emerging very quickly." Patricia reached for another folder, this one containing what appeared to be a comprehensive communication strategy. "We're going to beat her at her own game, but we're going to use weapons she doesn't understand. While she's planning to use traditional media and social connections, we're going to deploy the full power of your scientific achievements and professional network." She outlined a plan that was both elegant and devastating in its simplicity. Rather than trying to defend against Victoria's attacks, we would proactively establish the truth about my work through channels that Victoria couldn't control or influence. The strategy involved coordinating with my colleagues at the CDC, leveraging relationships with international health organizations, and ensuring that the full scope of my recent breakthrough became public knowledge before the wedding. "The beauty of this approach," Patricia explained, "is that we're not attacking your mother directly. We're simply making sure that accurate information about your work is available to anyone who wants to verify your achievements. When she tries to diminish your career, she'll be contradicting established facts that have already been reported by credible sources." Over the next 2 hours, we developed a detailed timeline for implementing the strategy. Patricia would coordinate with her media contacts to ensure that stories about the pandemic prevention breakthrough were published in major outlets. My colleagues at the CDC would provide background briefings to science journalists, explaining the significance of the research and my role in leading the project. International health organizations would issue statements recognizing the global impact of our work. "By the time your mother tries to reshape the narrative at the wedding," Patricia concluded, "the truth about your achievements will already be established in the public record. Any attempt to discredit you will look petty and uninformed, particularly to the influential people she's hoping to impress." As our meeting concluded, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about what lay ahead. For years, I had accepted Victoria's dismissal of my work as the price of maintaining family relationships. I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than defending my achievements. But Patricia's analysis had made it clear that this wasn't just about family dynamics anymore. Victoria's planned attack could damage my professional reputation, and undermine the credibility of the scientific work that had just saved millions of lives. "Emma," Patricia said as I prepared to leave, "I want you to remember something your father once told me about fighting for what's right. He said that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that seem personal but are really about defending principles that matter to the world. Your work isn't just a career, it's a calling that serves humanity. Don't let anyone diminish that, even if they share your DNA." The drive back to my apartment gave me time to process everything Patricia had revealed. The woman I had trusted to guide me through family relationships had been preparing to sabotage my professional reputation at the most important moment of my career. The mother who claimed to love me was planning to publicly humiliate me in front of the very people whose respect and recognition I had earned through years of dedicated service. But alongside the hurt and anger, I felt something else growing, a determination to fight back, not with the petty tactics Victoria favored, but with the power of truth and the strength of genuine achievement. My father had taught me that the most important work often required personal sacrifice, that standing up for scientific integrity sometimes meant standing against those closest to you. The time had come to honor that lesson, to defend not just my own reputation but the value of the work that countless researchers like my father had dedicated their lives to pursuing. Victoria had chosen the battlefield, but she had no idea what kind of opponent she was about to face. The daughter she had dismissed as a failure was about to demonstrate the full power of scientific truth in the hands of someone who understood its value. Patricia's phone call came that evening, just as I was reviewing the research files I would need for the upcoming media interviews. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had just put the first pieces of a complex strategy into motion. "Emma," she said, "the Washington Post wants to interview you tomorrow about the pandemic prevention work. They're planning a front-page story for Sunday's edition, timed to coincide with the International Health Conference. Are you ready to tell the world what you've really accomplished?" The Washington Post interview took place in their Los Angeles bureau, a sleek, modern office overlooking the city skyline. Reporter Jennifer Martinez had flown in from D.C. specifically for this story, her reputation as one of the nation's premier science journalists preceding her. She had spent weeks researching the pandemic prevention project, interviewing sources at the CDC and WHO, building a comprehensive understanding of what my team had achieved. As I sat across from her in the conference room, surrounded by her notes and recording equipment, I felt the weight of finally being able to tell the complete story. For 18 months, I had worked under strict confidentiality requirements, unable to share the magnitude of what we were facing or the breakthrough we had achieved. Now, with government clearance to discuss the declassified aspects of our work, I could finally reveal how close the world had come to catastrophe. "Dr. Rodriguez," Jennifer began, her voice professional but warm, "let's start with the basics. Can you explain what H7N9 Delta was and why it posed such a significant threat?" Her question opened the floodgates, allowing me to describe the viral characteristics that had made this pathogen so dangerous, the modeling that showed its potential for global spread, and the race against time that had defined our response. For the next 3 hours, I walked her through every aspect of the project, from the initial detection of the virus in remote Asian villages to the final implementation of our treatment protocol. I explained how my father's research methodologies had provided the foundation for our breakthrough, how his work on protein structures had inspired the approach that ultimately saved millions of lives. The journalist's eyes widened as she grasped the full scope of what had been accomplished, the disaster that had been averted through scientific collaboration and dedication. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said as our interview concluded, "what you've described is one of the most significant public health achievements of the modern era. Why hasn't this story been told before? Why don't people know what you've accomplished?" Her question cut to the heart of everything I had been struggling with, the invisibility that had characterized my entire career. I chose my words carefully, wanting to be truthful without appearing to complain. The nature of pandemic prevention work is that our greatest successes are the disasters that never happen. When we do our jobs well, the public never knows how close they came to catastrophe. It's the opposite of most fields, where success is measured by visible achievement. In public health, our victories are measured by the absence of tragedy. The story ran on Sunday morning exactly as Patricia had predicted. The headline read, "The Scientist Who Saved the World: How Dr. Emma Rodriguez Prevented a Global Pandemic." Below it was a photograph of me in my laboratory, surrounded by the equipment and research materials that had made the breakthrough possible. The article was comprehensive and detailed, explaining not just what we had accomplished but why it mattered, how close civilization had come to facing a crisis that would have dwarfed COVID-19. Within hours of the article's publication, my phone began ringing with interview requests from major news networks. CNN wanted me for their morning show, NPR requested an hour-long interview for their science program, and 60 Minutes was interested in a comprehensive feature story. The scientific community responded with equal enthusiasm, as colleagues from around the world reached out to congratulate me and request collaboration on future projects. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Marcus and Rachel's wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday, giving the story a full week to circulate and gain momentum. By the time Victoria's influential friends gathered for the ceremony, my achievements would be common knowledge among anyone who followed current events or scientific news. But Victoria's response to the media coverage was swift and vindictive. On Tuesday morning, I received a call from Marcus, his voice strained and uncomfortable. "Emma," he said without preamble, "Mother wants to see you. She scheduled a family dinner for Thursday night, and she says it's important that you attend. She wants to discuss your recent media attention and how it affects the family." The invitation felt more like a summons, and I suspected this was Victoria's attempt to regain control of the narrative before the wedding. She had probably been blindsided by the Washington Post story, caught off guard by the positive coverage and the revelation of just how significant my work had been. This dinner would be her opportunity to reassert her authority and attempt to minimize the impact of my newfound recognition. I arrived at the family estate on Thursday evening to find Victoria waiting in the formal dining room, the same space where we had shared countless uncomfortable meals over the years. She had dressed for the occasion in an elegant black dress with pearls, her appearance impeccable as always. But there was tension in her posture, a tightness around her eyes that suggested she was not entirely in control of the situation. Marcus was already seated at the table, looking uncomfortable in his tailored suit. Rachel sat beside him, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sympathetic when they met mine. The setting was formal and intimidating, clearly designed to establish Victoria's authority from the moment I walked into the room. "Emma," Victoria said as I took my seat, "I'm sure you're feeling quite pleased with yourself after all this media attention. But I think it's important that we discuss how your recent publicity affects the family's reputation and business interests." Her tone was measured but cold, carrying the implication that my achievements were somehow problematic rather than celebratory. The dinner proceeded with excruciating formality, each course served by uniformed staff, while Victoria controlled the conversation with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. She spoke about the importance of family unity, about how individual achievements needed to be balanced against collective interests. Her words were carefully chosen, designed to sound reasonable while subtly undermining the significance of my work. "Of course, we're all proud of your government work," she said as the main course was served. "But I think it's important to maintain perspective. Scientific research is a collaborative effort, and no single person can take credit for preventing a pandemic. The media tends to oversimplify these stories, to create heroes where the reality is much more complex." Her strategy was becoming clear. Rather than directly attacking my achievements, she was attempting to diminish them through context and qualification. She wanted to plant seeds of doubt about whether I deserved the recognition I was receiving, whether my role had been as significant as the media portrayed. "Mother," I said quietly, setting down my fork, "the research was indeed collaborative, but leadership matters in scientific projects just as much as it does in business. The treatment protocol that prevented this pandemic was developed under my direction, using methodologies I designed based on Father's earlier work. The international health organizations didn't recognize my contributions by accident." Victoria's composure slipped slightly at the mention of my father, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Your father was a dedicated researcher," she replied, "but he never sought this kind of public attention. He understood that true service was quiet and humble, not splashed across newspaper headlines." The comment was designed to sting, to suggest that my media coverage somehow violated my father's values or memory. But it revealed more about Victoria's own insecurities than about my motivations. She had spent years minimizing his contributions to justify her own worldview, and now she was using his memory as a weapon against his daughter's success. Actually, Mother, I said, my voice growing stronger, Father always believed that scientific achievements should be shared with the public. He wrote extensively about the importance of science communication, about helping people understand how research protects their health and safety. He would have been proud to see his work helping to save millions of lives. The dinner continued for another hour, with Victoria making increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative around my achievements. She suggested that government work was inherently less valuable than private sector success, that academic recognition was less meaningful than business profits, that media attention was somehow unseemly for a serious professional. Each argument revealed her growing desperation to maintain her position as the family's primary success story. As the evening concluded, Victoria made her final play. "Emma," she said as we prepared to leave the dining room, "I hope you'll remember at the wedding that this is Marcus and Rachel's day. It would be inappropriate to discuss your work or draw attention away from the celebration. Family occasions should focus on family, not individual achievements." The request was framed as consideration for the bride and groom, but its true purpose was transparent. Victoria wanted to ensure that none of her influential wedding guests would have the opportunity to congratulate me or discuss my recent recognition. She was trying to impose a gag order disguised as family etiquette. "Of course," I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I would never want to detract from Marcus and Rachel's special day. I'm sure everyone will be focused on celebrating their happiness." But as I drove home that evening, I knew that Victoria's attempts to control the situation were futile. The story was already out there, spreading through social media and professional networks in ways she couldn't monitor or influence. The scientific community was buzzing with excitement about the pandemic prevention breakthrough, and the political establishment was taking notice of the researcher who had quietly saved the world. The wedding day arrived with perfect California weather, clear skies and gentle breezes that made the country club gardens look like something from a magazine. The venue was spectacular, an exclusive establishment overlooking the Pacific Ocean where the state's political and business elite gathered for their most important celebrations. Victoria had spared no expense, transforming the ballroom into an elegant showcase that would be featured in society magazines for months to come. I arrived dressed conservatively in a navy blue dress, my hair styled simply, my jewelry understated. My goal was to blend into the background, to avoid giving Victoria any ammunition for her narrative about attention-seeking behavior. But as I moved through the cocktail reception, I noticed guests recognizing me from the recent media coverage, their expressions shifting from polite interest to genuine respect as they realized who I was. The ceremony itself was beautiful and moving, with Marcus and Rachel exchanging vows that spoke of love, partnership, and mutual support. Watching them, I felt genuinely happy for my brother, hopeful that his marriage might help him develop the independence and strength of character that Victoria's influence had sometimes undermined. Rachel caught my eye during the service and smiled warmly, a gesture that suggested our alliance remained strong despite the family tensions. The reception began with the traditional toasts, Victoria speaking eloquently about the joy of seeing her son find happiness with such a wonderful partner. Her words were gracious and heartfelt, focusing appropriately on the couple's future together. Marcus spoke next, thanking the guests for sharing their special day and expressing his love for Rachel with genuine emotion. But then came an unexpected moment that changed everything. As the formal toasts concluded and the reception moved into its social phase, a distinguished older gentleman approached our family table. I recognized him immediately, Senator Robert Chen, chairman of the Senate Health Committee and one of the most powerful figures in Washington healthcare policy. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said to Victoria, his voice carrying the authority of his office, "I wanted to personally congratulate you on your daughter's extraordinary achievement. Dr. Rodriguez's work preventing the H7N9 Delta pandemic will go down in history as one of the most significant public health accomplishments of our time." Victoria's smile froze as she processed what the senator was saying. Around our table, conversations stopped as other guests turned to listen. The senator continued, unaware of the family dynamics he was disrupting. I had the privilege of being briefed on Dr. Rodriguez's research during the congressional hearings last month. What she accomplished was nothing short of miraculous. The modeling shows that without her breakthrough, we could have been looking at 40 million deaths worldwide. She literally saved civilization as we know it. The silence that followed was deafening. Every guest within earshot was staring at me with expressions of awe and respect, finally understanding the magnitude of what I had achieved. Victoria's carefully constructed narrative about my insignificant government job crumbled in real time, as one of the most powerful politicians in America publicly praised my work. But Senator Chen wasn't finished. In fact, he continued, reaching into his jacket pocket, I have some news that I think Dr. Rodriguez will want to hear. He pulled out an official-looking envelope with the presidential seal. I was asked to deliver this personally. Dr. Rodriguez, the president has asked me to inform you that the Medal of Freedom ceremony has been moved up to next week. He wants to recognize your achievement as quickly as possible, and he's planning to use the ceremony to announce a major new initiative in pandemic preparedness research. The envelope contained an official invitation to the White House, signed by the president himself. As I read the elegant script, I felt the eyes of 300 wedding guests focused on me, their earlier polite interest transformed into genuine amazement. The most prestigious civilian honor in America was being awarded to the woman Victoria had spent years dismissing as a failure. Furthermore, Senator Chen added, his voice carrying across the now silent ballroom, I understand that the president plans to quote extensively from Dr. Rodriguez's research in his upcoming State of the Union address. He's calling her work a, quote, triumph of American scientific excellence, and using it as an example of why we need to increase funding for government research programs. The transformation in the room was immediate and complete. Guests who had been making polite small talk about business deals and social events were now approaching me with expressions of deep respect, wanting to shake hands with someone who had received such unprecedented recognition. The conversation shifted entirely, with people asking detailed questions about my research and expressing genuine awe at what I had accomplished. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, watching her carefully orchestrated social event become a celebration of her daughter's achievements. The influential friends she had hoped to impress were more interested in talking to me than to her, more fascinated by stories of pandemic prevention than by discussions of real estate development. Her position as the family's primary success story was evaporating before her eyes. The moment that sealed her humiliation came when Rachel stood up at the head table, her wedding dress gleaming in the ballroom lights. She raised her champagne glass and addressed the assembled guests with a clear, strong voice that carried across the room. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, before we continue celebrating, I want to take a moment to honor someone very special. Dr. Emma Rodriguez isn't just my new sister-in-law. She's a hero who saved millions of lives while asking for nothing in return. Her dedication to protecting public health represents the very best of what it means to serve others. Rachel turned toward me, her expression filled with respect and admiration. Emma, you've shown me what real success looks like. It's not measured in profit margins or social recognition, but in the lives you touch and the difference you make in the world. Thank you for being an inspiration to all of us. The applause that followed was thunderous and sustained. 300 of Southern California's most influential people rising to their feet to honor my achievements. In that moment, surrounded by genuine respect and recognition, I finally understood what my father had meant about the power of quiet service. The work itself was the reward, but having that work acknowledged by people who understood its value made the journey feel complete. As the evening continued, I found myself surrounded by guests eager to learn more about my research, to understand how someone could prevent a global catastrophe while working in relative anonymity. Scientists, politicians, business leaders, and journalists all wanted to hear the story firsthand, to understand the intersection of dedication, expertise, and opportunity that had made the breakthrough possible. Victoria spent the remainder of the reception trying to regain control of the social dynamics, but her efforts felt forced and desperate. The narrative had shifted permanently, and no amount of charm or influence could restore her position as the family's most accomplished member. Her friends were polite but distracted, more interested in the medical researcher who had saved the world than in the real estate developer who had built a regional empire. Near the end of the evening, as guests began to make their departures, Victoria approached me with an expression I had never seen before. The confidence and authority that had defined her for as long as I could remember had been replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. "Emma," she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone, "perhaps we should talk soon about how to handle all this attention you're receiving. The family might benefit from some coordination in our public messaging." It was a concession disguised as a business proposition, an acknowledgement that she could no longer ignore or diminish my achievements. But it was also a final attempt to maintain some control over my success, to insert herself into my story as an advisor or manager. "Thank you, Mother," I replied with genuine politeness. "But I think I have the situation well in hand. The White House communications team has been very helpful, and my colleagues at the CDC are experienced in managing media attention for scientific breakthroughs." The gentle rejection was perhaps more devastating than any angry confrontation could have been. I wasn't fighting her or arguing with her. I was simply operating at a level where her influence and expertise were no longer relevant. She had built her power on controlling narratives and managing relationships, but my achievements existed in a realm where her traditional tools had no impact. 6 months later, I stood in the Rose Garden of the White House as President Harrison placed the Presidential Medal of Freedom around my neck. The ceremony was attended by heads of state, Nobel laureates, and leaders from every field of human endeavor. My mother and brother were there, sitting in the audience and watching as their family's black sheep received the highest honor America could bestow. In his remarks, the president spoke about the nature of heroism, about how the most important victories often happen away from public view, achieved by people who choose service over recognition. He quoted my father's research, describing how one generation's dedication to scientific truth had enabled the next generation's breakthrough achievement. "Dr. Emma Rodriguez represents the very best of American values," the president declared, his words carried by television networks around the world. "Her work reminds us that the greatest achievements come not from seeking fame or fortune but from dedicating yourself to something larger than personal ambition. She has saved more lives than anyone in this room, and she did it while asking for nothing in return except the opportunity to serve." As I stood there in the warm afternoon sunlight, wearing the medal that represented a lifetime of service and sacrifice, I thought about my father and the lessons he had taught me about the value of quiet dedication. The recognition was gratifying, but it wasn't the real reward. The real reward was knowing that somewhere in the world, millions of people were living their lives, raising their families, and pursuing their dreams because of work that had been done in a windowless laboratory by someone they would never meet. The applause from the Rose Garden audience was warm and sustained, but it couldn't compare to the message I had received the previous week from a young researcher in Bangladesh who was using our treatment protocols to prevent a local outbreak. She had written to thank me for sharing the research freely, for making sure that life-saving treatments were available to everyone who needed them, regardless of their ability to pay. That message, from someone whose name I didn't know in a country I had never visited, represented everything my father had taught me about the true meaning of success. It wasn't about winning recognition from people who had previously dismissed you. It was about using your talents to make the world a little safer, a little healthier, a little better for the people who would come after you. Victoria and I eventually found our way to a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than her need for dominance or my hunger for approval. She never fully understood the work I did, but she learned to take pride in achievements that couldn't be measured in profit margins or social connections. And I learned that seeking validation from people who measured worth differently than I did was a waste of energy that could be better spent on the work itself. The story of our family's transformation became a cautionary tale about the difference between success and significance, between recognition and impact. But more importantly, it became a testament to the power of staying true to your values even when the people closest to you question their worth. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not by changing other people's minds, but by refusing to let their limitations define your potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.